Welcome to the program. I'm Yeon-ho Kim. In this segment of VOA Roundtable Discussion, I'm joined by Dr. Victor Cha, former Director for Asian Affairs in the White House NSC, and Mr. Robert Carlin, co-author of The Two Koreas, to talk about the prospects of the North Korean regime in 2014. Welcome to both of you to VOA. Thank you for joining us. Mr. Carlin, let me start with you first. Do you think the execution of Chang Song-taek actually helped Kim Jong-un to consolidate his power grip?
You know, every time I'm asked that question, I'm afraid I have to give the same answer, which is it's too soon to tell. It's only about 50 days or so since the execution. And I don't think we have had enough time to see what the ultimate impact of that is. I'd say in the last 50 days, we haven't seen anything. There's been nothing visible to suggest that it has shaken the regime to its foundations. But I'm willing to give it some more time before in my own mind, I'm comfortable in making a judgment.
Dr. Cha, do you have any specific idea about what's going on in North Korean regime?
Well, I mean, as Bob said, we're all guessing at this point as to what's going on. I would tend to agree. You can't make a definitive judgment one way or the other. You know, has he consolidated power, or is this a sign that things are falling apart? It's still too early to tell. I think it's fairly safe to say that the execution of Chang was a surprise to most, if not everybody, who follows this issue closely. And I would agree, we have to wait and see what's happened. I mean, obviously the other missing piece of this is the aunt, Kim Kyung-hee, and where she is. You know, there's some reports that say she's out of the country right now for medical treatment. And so that's another important piece of this whole thing. But clearly very unsettling events that we've seen as we enter 2014, and something we have to watch very closely.
If so, what specific change or signals would you be waiting for to make any judgment on that issue?
There's going to be an SPA meeting in March. And if they follow the routine, or the new routine, it will be preceded by a Central Committee plenum. And at that plenum, if they're going to make significant personnel changes, we're liable to see it then. And then at the SPA meeting, we'll see more personnel changes probably, as well as a new explanation of the policy. So I would think that by March, if there are going to be major realignments as a result of the Jang execution, we'll see them at that point.
Dr. Chan, do you have any other signals in mind?
No, well, he's the expert on that. So I think that's a very good timeline to think about. You know, the last time we saw elements of change inside the North Korean system publicly was at the last plenum where they elevated Chang Song-taek to a four-star general, as well as Kim Kyung-hee, as well as Kim Jong-un. So I think that's a very important benchmark that Bob mentioned.
If there's anything, what would be the measures Kim Jong-un take to consolidate his power in the future, in the near future?
You know, what we are faced with now is sort of wrestling with our own notions of how strong his support base was when he came in. If you assume that as I do, that the succession really started at least by early 2008, even before Kim Jong-il's stroke, he is now entering his 7th year in sort of this process. And therefore, I just assume that some of the consolidation took place before he actually took over, and that when he took over, he had a little bit more of a foundation than a lot of us on the outside assumed. So we may be behind the curve in understanding exactly what he's looking at in terms of his own exercise of power within the regime. As Victor said, we're all speculating, but it seems to me that if one is going to speculate on the negative side, assuming that he has less power and needs to consolidate it, one should also look at the other possibility, which is that he had more than we imagined, that we were the ones who thought he had a deficit, and that by getting rid of his uncle, he's actually taken maybe close to the final step in consolidating his position. So there are a range of working hypotheses that we should keep in mind, it seems to me, as we're watching this thing unfold.
Dr. Cha, anything you want to add?
So I think that indicators of him being more firmly in control might be the actual enunciation of some comprehensive policy to address some of the problems in the country. Now, clearly, that could be a matter of policy choice by the leadership, but there's some pretty obvious problems. And some element of an economic policy that maybe doesn't have to necessarily be aimed at opening, but was clearly aimed at creating whatever incentives within the system, something with regard to social welfare. I mean, because he's talked about that in some of his initial statements about the country. So I guess, I mean, for me, aside from the whole question of execution and palace politics, it would be some semblance of a comprehensive policy, whether it's a one-year plan, a three-year plan, a five-year plan, something like that. I think would be a sign that things are moving more in the mode of business as usual in governing a country.
Dr. Cha, what about Kim Jong-un's leadership style? Have you noticed anything unique about his leadership compared to his father and grandfather?
Sure, I think there are a lot. I mean, there are elements that are similar. So, physically, obviously, they've made him look more like his grandfather, and I think there are reasons for that. But in terms of leadership style, there are clear differences. I mean, the fact that he operates in some instances as a first couple with his wife is something that we really haven't seen before. All the focus on sort of the modern, dare I say, more Western accoutrements of life, ski resorts, amusement parks, these sorts of things are things that we haven't seen before, particularly as a first impression, first public acts by a North Korean leader to focus on these sorts of things. The very obvious spectacle of Dennis Rodman and his welcoming of Dennis Rodman, while at the same time not granting meetings with people like Eric Schmidt of Google and others who came to the country. So in terms of leadership style, I think there are some clear differences, and perhaps that reflects age, the fact that he's quite young in starting off publicly as a leader versus Kim Jong-il. Not much younger than Kim Il-sung when he started, but of course those were quite different circumstances. And I guess also in the sense that I don't know if this is style or substance. The actions that he's taken in terms of purging in both the military and the party, these things have kind of happened sequentially, first with the military, particularly Lee Young-ho and other generals, and then the party, Chang Sung-taek. To me, what's interesting about that is historically, I think North Korean leaders have tended to favor one of these institutions over the other. Kim Il-sung, I think it was the party. Kim Jong-il, clearly it was the military. And perhaps we still are in a transition period, but what's distinct to me about Kim Jong-un is that he has really been willing to cleanse, if you will, or shape, reform, whatever, both of these institutions at the same time, which is ambitious. It could also be very dangerous.
Mr. Carlin, do you think Kim Jong-un's new leadership style actually works for himself?
he probably has a window of opportunity in which to put his stamp on things and to demonstrate to people that he can actually get things done. I don't know what that is in North Korea. I don't know what people's tolerance level is, for example. I suspect, though, if he has a long timeline in his own mind, and he might well think that he's going to be here much longer than either the American president or the South Korean president, he's not in a hurry. He's not worried about his legacy quite yet. He's got some other things he has to establish. I think Victor made a good point that this SPA meeting could present him an opportunity to step off with some significant policies that would get people's attention. You know, it's one of those things we'll wait and we'll see. The North Koreans tend not to like to have grand plans other than their rhetorical sense. Mm-hmm. They just don't operate that way, and they haven't for a while. But we'll see if he has a new approach to governing. Maybe he'll try something like that.
I mean, the sort of historical equivalent might be when Kim Il-sung first started. You know, Kim Il-sung, started very young age, handpicked by the Soviets, had to come in and really establish himself. And one of the things that he started with was actually a very ambitious five-year plan, economic five-year plan. And that didn't go very well. So, because for no other reason, because the Soviets were not happy with that plan and actually cut down on a lot of the assistance it was giving. It wasn't willing to subsidize subsequent five-year plans. So, there are some hazards to doing something like that because, once you sort of expose to everybody in a plan, 3 or 5 year plan, what you're going to do, you leave yourself open to first showing, possible dependence on others like China, and then allowing others to criticize what you're doing. So, there may be incentives for him not to do that in the next SPA.
We just briefly discussed Kim Jong-un's economic policy, but how would you define his economic policy? Do you think there is highly likely that his economic policy will be successful, Mr. Collin?
The theme that I've seen since he made his first speech in April of 2012 is his assertion that in order for him to concentrate on the economy, he needs what he calls a peaceful strategic environment around the country. This isn't brand new to North Korean thinking, but he seems to have emphasized it quite a bit. And I think that's sort of what's been pushing a lot of what he's been trying to accomplish with the South Koreans and with the Chinese, and to a lesser extent with the Americans. What's the first thing he's going to do on the economy? He's thinking about, I believe, he's thinking about the question of allocation of resources. Whether or not he can actually do something in terms of changing the allocation, reducing military spending in some way, shape, or form, and giving more resources to the civilian economy, I suspect that's one of the things that is being contemplated, because it's the same thing his father had to contemplate in 2002. And they had a debate about that, and they didn't move ahead with it. And he can't move ahead with it unless he's got this environment set externally. And it's always, for the North Koreans, it's always a problem accomplishing that.
Dr. Chang?
Well, we don't know. I mean, I think there have been small things that we've seen with his on the spot inspections and some of the small efforts at privatization of farm plots and things that are signs or what could be elements of a larger economic strategy. But I think Bob's right in the sense that there is this tension here between, you know, coming up with some sort of economic policy that's aimed at addressing the ills in the country, or being completely focused on the prior step, which is how you reallocate resources within the system.
Right.
And historically, they've never gotten past that first step. Right? And so I think that is the same challenge that they face with regard to economic policy. I would say that I wasn't necessarily one of these people, but there were a number of experts and analysts of North Korea when Kim Jong-un first took control that were quite optimistic about the prospects of a new and different leader, educated outside of North Korea, part of the sort of elite offspring in North Korea of senior party people, senior military people that have tasted the outside world, that might move forward with something that would be much more ambitious and aggressive. I don't think that many people hold that view anymore today, but it was there early on among folks who were looking at the North Korea problem.
Can we add one more thing to what you said, and that is the, you know, in the plenum speech last March, which also introduced this idea of the concentration on nuclear weapons and everything. At the same time, Kim said he wanted to see special economic zones in every province. And they followed through with that. We didn't see a lot going on, but obviously within the system they were working on it, because last December they announced however many there were there 12, something like that, zones, I think about 2 in every province except South Hwanghae, which is interesting for another reason. So the idea that they would sort of devolve authority more to the local level to run these economic zones is a pretty important, would be a very important step if they did it, and would tell us something more about how he thinks he's going to run the country. We haven't seen it completely come to fruition yet, but it hasn't been cut off either.
Right, and so the things we'd look for there would be, so if they follow up with, you know, infrastructure projects, and in particular if they follow up with a legal infrastructure.
That's right.
That is.
And they had a
conducive.
conference on that in Pyongyang not so long ago, and the people, some of the people who were there were pretty impressed about how the North Korean participants had really done their homework.
Let's briefly talk about the North-South relationship. North Korea has been very aggressive in their charm offensive with the South. What do you think North Korea is ultimately aiming at this point?
Well, I certainly think in the short term they would like to see some of these inter-Korean projects reopen, Kumgang in particular, Kumgang tourism project, and Kaesong. I don't know if I would describe what they're doing as sort of a very aggressive smile diplomacy. I think there's been a little bit of hot and cold in terms of their behavior. I think what has become clear on the South Korean side from President Park's New Year's address is an effort by the South Korean government to really focus on the North Korean people in its inter-Korean policy, obviously focusing on political military issues and nuclear issues, but also a new focus, if you will, on the people. And I think that's why she talked about being open to humanitarian assistance and other sorts of activities with the North Korean people. So in that sense, I think some of what we're seeing from the North is a reaction to what they perceive coming out of the South. The problem, though, in North-South relations, I think, as we all know well, is that the trend lines are never very predictive of the future. In other words, just because we see a starting point in which both sides, for example, are now talking about family reunions sometime in February, that has never been a good predictor or indicator of North Korea's policies towards the U.S., North Korea's policies towards China, or even inter-Korean relations. What can start off as a thaw can easily turn negative quite suddenly. And so, at least the thing I'm concerned about now is that, there's an effort to restart these family reunions sometime in February, and then the U.S. ROK military exercises will start up shortly after that, and then how the DPRK then responds to that could take us in a different direction.
Mr. Carlin, do you think North Korea is in a good position to achieve their goals, if there's any?
Which goals?
In dealing with their
South
Korean partner?
Well, they've begun what I characterize as the dance. It didn't look like it was going to get underway at first because the Blue House was a little bit resistant and dismissive. And what you saw throughout, for example, South Korean official statements and background briefings and everything was the idea that every time North Korea advances proposals like this, it's always followed by a provocation, which, as a matter of fact, isn't true, but also is a way of just dismissing the North Korean policies as a trick. That has begun to see a little bit of shift in that in the past, even just the past few days. How so? It was the South Koreans who first said, oh, incidentally, these exercises aren't going to have strategic bombers.
Right.
Now, if they were so worried about a provocation and so concerned to demonstrate to North Korea that they better not do anything provocative because we're ready, suddenly they've started backing away. And I don't know why, but it does seem to me that that's, in a sense, that's answering some of what the North Koreans have talked about in their National Defense Commission statement. So this dance is getting a little bit more serious. Now, as Victor points out, there's no straight lining predicting on these things. Dialogue has to evolve one step at a time, and it can be thrown off at any moment. The North Koreans are very much dependent on what President Park has in mind. And she also does have to worry about what they have in mind, obviously. But their policy can't go anywhere unless she responds, probes, let's say. If she probes and discovers there's nothing there, well, then we'll all understand that. If she probes and discovers the North Koreans want to go the next millimeter forward, well, then that's how this thing progresses. Not with big breakthroughs normally, just little bits at a time.
Let's briefly talk about the U.S. point of view. What would be the biggest concern at this time for the Obama administration in terms of regime stability problem in North Korea?
Well, I think the biggest concern for the Obama administration right now is the nuclear program. And within the nuclear program, it's the so-called covert uranium-based program, I think is the major concern, because if developed, that could potentially exponentially increase the North Korean capacity to produce nuclear bombs. So I think that's clearly has been and continues to be the main concern. With regard to regime stability, again, I think we're entirely in a guessing game here. I think the United States obviously has allies and partners in the North Korean issue, whether it's South Korea or China. I think that the execution of Chang Sung-taek was a shock to everyone, including the Chinese, who I think saw Chang Sung-taek as their window into the North Korean system. So sure, I think for the United States, it's a concern. I mean, when you have the sort of dramatic and draconian events taking place inside of North Korea, it's got to raise some concern about how stable the regime is. And if it's not very stable on the inside, whether that gets manifested in some sort of external provocative behavior. So, I think the Obama administration's concerns in that sense haven't changed that much. It's still the nuclear issue, but it's also this added dimension of, how stable is everything given what's happened in leadership circles over the past few months.
Mr. Carlin, do you think Obama administration is looking at North Korea in terms of regime stability, but also trying to relate this issue to the nuclear issue somehow?
I do not understand what Washington is thinking these days. Dr. Cha and I agree that if, as he has outlined, Washington's primary concern is the nuclear issue and even the HEU program, then the policies we've been following, which is almost entirely strategic patience with a dollop of sanctions thrown in, has done nothing really to interrupt that. So there's a mismatch between what we're doing and what we want to achieve, at least in the short term, and the short term has now gone on for 6 years. So again, frankly, I don't understand why it is that if we are concerned about these things, we aren't doing something different to protect our interests, other than essentially sit by and watch the North Koreans continue to develop their program.
Do you think it is time for the Obama administration to start thinking of reaching out to North Korea to manage the situation in and around the Korean Peninsula?
I'd agree with Bob. I mean, strategic patience essentially means that North Korea continues to build their weapons program. Now they've reached the point of being able to at least demonstrate putting a payload vehicle into orbit, and who knows what else they may be able to demonstrate in future tests. So what we're doing now is, if our main concern is the growth of the nuclear program, what we're doing now, in spite of the sanctions, doesn't seem to be curtailing that nuclear program. What do you do instead of that? This is the big question. And I think in terms of the notion of reaching out or engaging, much as some of us might think that's the right thing to do, I just don't think there's any political will in Washington right now to do something like that. The one thing that there appears to be more political will for is on the other side of the equation, which is on the sanction side. I think, and this is in part because of Iran, I think what the Iran deal did was it didn't create an incentive in Washington to say, hey, we can negotiate with North Korea because look at what we're able to do with Iran. Instead, it created a narrative when people said it was the sanctioning on Iran that got them to the table, and the sanctions on Iran are much bigger in scope and membership than the sanctions on North Korea. Therefore, we need to increase the sanctions on North. I think that's the debate that we're seeing now, or the discussion that we're seeing now in Washington, in part because I don't think there is any political will in the administration to try something different on the diplomacy side with North Korea.
Mr. Carlin, do you think it's time for the Obama administration to rethink its approach to North Korea?
They only have, 3 years left? 7, 8,
Yeah.
2 years left, whatever.
Yeah.
And time is getting very short. And the North Korean calculation is going to be fairly soon, it's not worth it. Because whatever they accomplish with this administration might get overturned by the next administration, so they're not going to expose themselves. So I'm afraid that a window of opportunity, if one exists, is going to be closing fairly soon, and we're going to be stuck just watching them produce more nuclear weapons.
American citizen Kenneth Bae has been detained in North Korea for more than a year. How do you think the release of Kenneth Bae will be worked out between the U.S. and North Korea?
Well, I don't know if he's going to be released. I mean, this is a terrible situation. We haven't had, as far as I know, since the Korean War, an American civilian being detained, tried, and put into a camp in this fashion. I guess if anything positive came out of the Dennis Rodman trips to North Korea, it was that everybody became aware of Kenneth Bae in a way that they had not been aware of him before. So it's a terrible situation, and my understanding is the State Department is using its channels as it normally does to try to get the release of these Americans, and the North Koreans have put Kenneth Bae on stage at least twice now to apologize for actions that he has taken. So it seems like the scene is all set for some sort of release, but I don't sense that there's anything that's going to lead to that imminently, and that's quite tragic.
Do you agree, Mr. Carlin?
I do. I think the less said about this problem in public, the better off it's going to be. And I certainly don't have anything to say that could help solve it, so I won't say anything at all.
Dr. Cha, Mr. Carlin, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sir.